My name is Stella Ndao, and I'm an honors student here at Missouri Southern, majoring in international studies. I'm here to briefly introduce Dr. Greitens, our speaker today, beyond just the information in your program guide. As you can see from her bio, Dr. Greitens' research and expertise focuses on East Asian studies. Her first encounter with this part of the world came when, in third grade, she gained a new baby sister from Seoul, South Korea. Her family immersed themselves in their new family member's culture, learning to cook traditional dishes and attending cultural events. This interest in the region would continue into adulthood as she centered her political science degree on the area. Her undergraduate experiences included a one-month exchange trip to South Korea and her senior thesis on smuggling networks in North Korea, getting published in a highly competitive academic journal. Dr. Greitens also began studying and learning Mandarin Chinese. She continued her studies at Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard, where she completed her PhD, with her research specialties being in East Asia and authoritarian regimes. She holds various teaching and research positions in numerous institutions, such as the University of Missouri, the Brookings Institution, and Harvard University. Some of the courses she teaches include Democracy and Dictatorship, Chinese Politics and Foreign Policy, and America's Wars in Asia. This is in addition to being the co-director of the Institute for Korean Studies at the University of Missouri. On a personal note, Dr. Greitens was married to Missouri Governor Eric Greitens, and they have 2 sons together. In your program guide, you'll see that she has published 1 book and is in the process of writing another. That published book is titled Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence, and it will be available for sale after this presentation for $20. And Dr. Greitens will be signing copies of it as well. With all that being said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheena Greitens.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Stella, for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning and to see so many people who are interested in Korea. I think it's particularly appropriate that you all chose to focus on Korea this semester because Missouri as a state has a really long and interesting history with Korea as a country. So if you think about President Truman, when he came back from being president, because of his role in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, he actually started an exchange program where Korean students could come. A lot of the universities in Korea had been devastated by the conflict. And so he set up a program where Korean students could come and study at institutions here in Missouri. And actually, as a result of that, at the University of Missouri, which is where I teach today, our largest alumni chapter outside of the state is not in the United States, not in Europe. The biggest alumni chapter outside of Missouri anywhere in the world is actually the one in South Korea. There's a really large community there and a long sort of set of ties between the state and in Korea. Missouri has really robust economic relationships, in part because of all that exchange. And Missouri farmers export a lot of their products to places like South Korea. And then Missouri also has a community of Korean adoptees who came and joined families here in Missouri and enriched our families and our communities that way. And that's actually, as Stella mentioned, that's how my interest in Korea started. When I was in 3rd grade, my parents adopted my younger sister from South Korea. And I had 2 brothers, but I really wanted a sister. I wanted there to be an even number of boys and girls in the house. I wanted some company with my younger brothers. And so my family just got really interested in Korea. We learned to cook Korean food, went to cultural events, learned a little bit about the Korean language. In fact, when I looked through the program of events you all are having, it reminded me a lot of the way that I first learned about Korea as a child with my family. And so, today a lot of my work is more academic and it's on a lot more political and military things, but the original interest that I had in Korea started from a personal and a family connection to the country. And so that still informs a lot of the work that I do today. Now, North Korea has been in the news a lot lately, particularly timely to have a semester of events about Korea, given what's going on in the news. And so what I thought I'd do today is start out by talking about what's going on in and behind this latest set of nuclear and missile tests. There's a lot of stuff, about, so I'm happy. I'll probably try to talk for a little bit shorter amount of time, and then leave lots of times for questions and discussion. So many of you probably saw this headline on September 3rd that North Korea had tested a new kind of nuclear weapon. And this immediately got headlines. It was actually North Korea's 6th nuclear test. They tested first in 2006, but it was actually the 6th test that got a lot of attention for a couple of reasons. First, this test was a lot bigger than the previous one. So this is a chart here of the tests from 2006 up to 2016, and the size of the earthquake that resulted from the test. Underground nuclear tests create an earthquake, so one of the things you know about how big the bomb is you look at the size of the earthquake. And you can't actually even graph the 6th test on here because it was about 10 times the size of the 5th one. So if you look at it, this is what monitoring station in Norway picked up as far as the earthquake, and you can see that this test is just much, much bigger. So for comparison, again, it was about 10 times the size of the previous test, and about 10 times the size of the atomic bomb that the United States dropped on Japan, on Hiroshima in 1945. This is a significant jump from where their program had been before. And the second reason that the test got people's attention is that North Korea claimed that it was testing a new kind of bomb design. And the night before the test, they put up these pictures on their sort of state-run media, KCNA, and said, look, we have this warhead design, we're going to test it soon. Here's Kim Jong-un, this guy in the middle pointing at the warhead. And the reason why this design, again, got a lot of attention is that it's supposed to fit on top of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And just in case people didn't get that from looking at this sort of peanut-shaped thing down here, North Korea very helpfully put on the back wall an illustration of the top of that missile warhead with the bomb inside it. Just in case you didn't quite get it from this part, they put the missile drawing in the background to make it super clear to everybody who was looking. It wasn't just this test, it was the combination of this nuclear test with some of the missile tests that North Korea has been carrying out in the last couple of years. The rate of North Korea's missile and nuclear testing really sped up when this new leader came into power in 2012. And so North Korea's been testing regularly, and each test, some of the tests fail, that's actually pretty normal for a missile program. But each test, they get a little bit better and they develop a new capability. So the estimate today, this is an estimate taken from the Heritage Foundation, is that North Korea, with this ICBM, is probably capable of hitting the United States with a nuclear warhead. Maybe not all of the country. You can see we're kind of right on that red line right here, where we are today. I wouldn't want to take that bet. This is something, this development really has gotten a lot of people's attention. The question is, what exactly is going on here? And I think the thing to start with is that there's been a tendency to kind of dismiss North Korea as this crazy place run by this 33-year-old kid with a funny haircut, and these guys with all these funny-looking medals, and this is just a wacko place that Hollywood makes fun of. Do we really have to take them seriously? I think now the answer is pretty clearly yes. North Korea has done what it said it was going to do. And it was easy to kind of laugh it off at the beginning. They're poor, they're isolated, they're backwards, they have crazy leaders. But they've been very consistent about delivering on what they promised on, and they've done it faster than most U.S. analysts and experts expected. North Korea makes it easy, actually, to dismiss. They, issue these sort of crazy threats with bombastic rhetoric and threaten to turn Seoul into a sea of fire. They insult U.S. presidents, South Korean presidents, other world leaders using really crude racist and sexist imagery, right? It's easy to dismiss them and not pay attention to what they're saying. But at this point, North Korea has been saying for months and actually years that it's been trying to develop longer-range missiles that could carry a nuclear warhead and threaten the United States. And that's pretty clearly now, they weren't there right away, but over the course of about 4 years of testing, they have developed that capability and done it pretty quickly. So they do what they say, and that's kind of one of the first things I think we should take away from some of these recent developments. I think then the bigger question is sort of a question about why they're doing this. What is it that North Korea wants? And if I had to summarize, what I've learned from a long time looking at and thinking about what North Korea wants, and in some cases, in just reading what they say, I think there are three things. The first thing is simply to survive. And that might sound really simple, but we're actually, when we talk about survival in this case, we're not talking about survival of the whole country or of ordinary people, right? We're talking about the survival of a very small group of people in this family, the Kim family, who run the country, and their inner circle. Right? These are the people, so that survival is a matter of protecting this regime, and in some cases it means protecting them from their own people. Right? Because these are not people who are in power because everybody voted and they got picked and they're popular. These are people who are in power through coercion rather than consent. And so they have a lot to be worried about. If you look historically at what happens to dictators who get kicked out of power, it isn't pretty. Most of them end up either in jail or dead. And so these folks think that to survive, they actually have to stay in power at the top of the system in North Korea. And so that's really what survival means for them. North Korea also wants to be accepted very clearly as a nuclear power. One of the first things that happened when Kim Jong-un, the third Kim to rule North Korea, after he came into power in 2012, is that North Korea added nuclear weapon status to its constitution. And so North Korea has been saying for at least 4 years, probably longer, that this is who they are and this is what's important to them. And Kim Jong-un, every time there's a missile or a nuclear test, you see pictures of him with this stuff. He's really made it a big part of his domestic image. And so there are both domestic and international sort of status and credibility reasons that mean that this is really important to North Korea. The third thing that North Korea wants, and this is the part that maybe gets discussed a little bit less often, because it's in the background, but it's been in the background since the Korean War, and I think it's important to understand, is that North Korea, again, if you look at its constitution, says very clearly, in fact, it talks about it even more than the nuclear weapons program, it says very clearly that its aim is to reunify the Korean peninsula under North Korean leadership. I think it's in the preamble to their constitution 12 times or something like that, if you count. So, that means two things in terms of what it wants from the United States. First, it wants U.S. troops off the Korean peninsula to about, roughly 30,000 troops in the Korean peninsula at any given point in time, with their families often. And then, we have a large civilian population that's there also either in support of military or just there for tourism or to do business or study abroad. I think that's a couple 100,000 people. I think it's around 200,000 people. So North Korea wants Americans off the Korean peninsula, and it wants to break the U.S.-Korea alliance so that Korea can be reunified under North Korean leadership. That's why the Korean War was fought, and that's a war that, in North Korea's mind, hasn't ended today. There's an armistice, a temporary ceasefire agreement in place on the Korean Peninsula. There's no peace treaty. There's no sort of formal declaration that the war itself is over. It's sort of been paused for 60-some years. And so North Korea is fairly clear that its long-term goal is reunification on North Korea's terms. Now, that doesn't mean that North Korea is going to take stupid risks to pursue reunification, right? North Korea has survived for decades now, and it won't do, I think that it won't do anything toward reunification if it jeopardizes the goal of keeping these folks in power at the top of the system. Right? So they're balancing these goals, and that's why that's a goal that's often in the background. But it is an important one to remember because North Korea has stated it pretty clearly. And again, I think part of what we need to do here is to take them at their word in terms of what their goals are and what they're trying to accomplish. So that's why what we're seeing with North Korea is, if you talk talk to nuclear analysts and experts on missile and nuclear programs, North Korea is really at this point, and especially for the last 4 years and the last year, been pretty much going for broke to achieve what those nuclear experts call a credible deterrent capabilities. Basically, that ability to hit the United States with a nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile. And so the reason is, so the question is, what is it about those three goals that I just mentioned, survival, nuclear status, and eventual reunification? What is it that means, how do you get from there to a nuclear ICBM specifically? And I think that the first thing is that it's a really good insurance for North Korea's survival. So if you look at what North Korea has done with a lot of its recent missile tests, what's actually significant is not just the missile that's being tested, but the situation that the missile launch occurs in. North Korea has been experimenting with a lot of different ways of launching a potentially nuclear missile. So one of those is to use what are called road mobile missile launchers. So this guy down here is actually Kim Jong-un, right there. I wouldn't put him that close to a missile launcher if I was, I don't know, hard to imagine you a Secret Service thinking that's a good idea in case the launch doesn't go so well or something. But that is him standing right next to this road mobile missile launcher. What that means is that before, North Korea had a launch pad, you could watch it via satellite, and you had to put the fuel into the missile, and that process took hours. So there's more warning time. North Korea has switched to using a solid fuel, so you can just kind of put it in and go. The missiles can now move, and North Korea has been experimenting with putting smaller missiles, but that's probably a first step toward bigger missiles, and also launching them from submarines. The reason that's a problem for the United States is you can't take those out ahead of time. And North Korea now has sort of both of those, right? It has the mobile missiles that are faster to fuel and potentially now ones that are underwater. That makes North Korea's arsenal what nuclear experts call survivable. It means that you could launch a preventive attack, but you can now no longer guarantee that you could take it out on a first strike. So the United States has to assume that if the United States tried to hit North Korea would still probably retain the capability underwater, on a truck somewhere, driving around mountains in North Korea, to fire a missile back, and that missile might be capable of taking out Los Angeles, Seattle, Chicago, Kansas City. That's the sort of the change that has happened that North Korea has been trying to demonstrate in the last few months. And that's why these pictures are important. Sometimes it's not even the missile technology, it's actually the way the missile is set up and the patterns and processes that lead to the launch that are what's so scary. And the other sort of thing to note about that is that sometimes the media has responded and said, well, we don't know that they're actually that good at this stuff. We're not sure they can do it. That's not particularly helpful at this point, because what they're trying to do is prove that this works. Right? That's why they're doing all these tests, is to convince the United States hitting us wouldn't do you any good, because you won't get everything and now we can hit you back. Right? That's the logic here that North Korea is trying to convey. And there is a really clear rationale for these tests, which is to try to convince the United States that any preventive or preemptive attack on North Korea wouldn't do any good, because it wouldn't get everything. There's a couple of reasons why we don't want them doing all these tests. One is that every time they test, they get better. The failure rate for the United States missile program early on was something around 60%. Right? It's kind of like baseball. You don't need to bat 1,000 to be really, really good at what you do. And every time North Korea has a failed test, its engineers go back to the drawing board, they work on the missiles some more, and then the next test works. That's pretty standard, and North Korea has actually made progress despite having some public failures. It's made progress faster than outside observers expected from a country, especially a poor country like North Korea. The other thing that's probably not great about this is that North Korea uses these tests as marketing. So North Korea, for the past 3 or 4 decades, has funded its regime and paid for Kim Jong-un's cognac and his yachts and all these things you hear about when Dennis Rodman goes and hangs out with him. All of that stuff is paid for in part by a whole set of illicit activities. North Korea defaulted on its debts in the 70s. It hasn't been able to borrow for a very long time, so its economy operates on this weird semi-cash basis. And to fund what it needs, it's ended up doing things like creating methamphetamine and exporting it to Japanese gangsters who then sell it for them on the street. They're basically drug wholesalers. They've done that with opioids as well. North Korea has produced the world's best counterfeit currency. The Secret Service calls it the super dollar, or the super note, because it's so good that you actually have to send it to a Federal Reserve Bank to pick up that it's a counterfeit. Ordinary banking machines like Bank of America or something wouldn't pick that up. They traffic in endangered species. You can see some ivory and rhino horns down here. North Korean diplomats have gotten busted carrying back tons of ivory from diplomatic posts in Africa. So North Korea has all of these channels to smuggle things around the world covertly. And that has included weapons. North Korea has sold almost every weapon system that the country has ever developed. And in fact, that includes probably some of its nuclear capabilities. So this is a very grainy satellite photo of a facility in Syria. And you all might remember that in 2007, there was this incident where the Israeli Air Force went in and took out a facility in Syria. The Syrian government got really upset. It turns out the International Atomic Energy Agency later concluded that that was a nuclear reactor that Syria was working on building. Wasn't clear exactly what type yet, but they were building it with North Korea's help. And that territory has since been under the control of ISIS. Thinking about what's happened in Syria since then. So tests are not great because they tell customers, hey, this stuff works. You might want to buy it, right? They show that North Korea is capable of producing this stuff, so the supply is there, and it actually increases demand because it makes the North Korean systems look more attractive, which is not a great development for the United States and its partners, especially if you're thinking about customers like Iran or Syria. So if that sounds depressing, you're perfectly reasonable. If you think about the United States options, there's a political scientist at Georgetown named Victor Cha who worked for the Bush administration on North Korea and wrote a book where he called North Korea the impossible state and termed it the land of lousy options, which I think is a pretty fair assessment. So if that's what you were thinking, you're in pretty good company here. So I wanted to go through some of the options that you'll hear debated a lot and sort of give you a sense of how I think policymakers, and this is generally across both administrations, have thought about these different options and how they might look a little bit different based on what's happened in the last few months with North Korea. The first one, so people usually talk about sort of is a preventive attack or preventive strike a possibility, and then sanctions and diplomacy. That's the three ways you usually hear the options phrased. And what I'll do at the end is kind of give you a slightly different way I think we could think about strategy toward North Korea. But what I want to do is talk through the options as you usually hear in the news media or analysts on TV talk about them first. The first one, if you're talking about a preventive strike, a couple of years ago, Bill Perry and Ashton Carter, who became Secretaries of Defense in two different Democratic administrations, wrote an op-ed where they called for taking one of North Korea's missiles out while it was fueling on that launch pad. This was back in the day when they had a launch pad and you couldn't move them and you had to take hours to fuel them. They said, look, the next time they look like they're fueling a missile, just take it out. And that was in 2006. Most people now think that that's not a good idea. It was controversial even then, but the idea now is that because North Korea has the potential to hit the United States in retaliation, that could trigger a nuclear war. And usually the number one goal of American policy has been to avoid that. And so, a preventive strike, even if it's very targeted and limited, we don't know how Kim Jong-un makes these decisions. And so if he decides to retaliate, most people now think that risk is just too high for the United States to try to do anything preemptively. So that really leaves sort of sanctions or diplomacy. I'll come back to that one in a minute. So this is a picture of our ambassador, Chris Hill, at some point in the mid-2000s as part of what were called the six-party talks. 6 countries trying to negotiate an end to North Korea's nuclear program through diplomacy. And they did reach a couple of short-term deals to freeze or to limit North Korea's capability. So there was some progress there using diplomacy and negotiations. The problem is that North Korea has backed out of just about every agreement it has ever made. Now, they usually find some reason to blame somebody else for that, and there's debate in the United States about how much of of that breakdown the United States could have avoided. But there's also pretty broad agreement that the fundamental problem here is that North Korea really wants a nuclear weapons program, and there aren't very many deals that are attractive that would convince North Korea to give that program up entirely. And in fact, one of the things you may see in the news in the coming weeks that the Chinese have been floating and that North Korea said, well, maybe, we're not sure, is that there's a Chinese proposal that North Korea should just freeze its program where it is in exchange for the United States and South Korea stopping their military exercises in and around the Korean Peninsula. And honestly, again, this is sort of across both administrations. That would be it's pretty tough to see how that's a good deal for the United States, because it requires accepting this North Korean threat and accepting behavior that's very clearly illegal if you look at UN resolutions under international law and what North Korea has agreed to do. There's no question North Korea has done some illegal proliferation activities, and it requires saying, never mind that, you can keep what you have, we'll live with this new threat to us, and oh, by the way, in exchange for just living with that threat, we'll also stop doing the exercises that are practiced defending ourselves against that threat that you've developed. Right? You can see why this is not a great, this is going to be a tough deal to convince the United States is a good option. So it's it's hard to see the diplomatic process get going. You'll probably hear some attempts made at conversation or dialogue, but if that's fundamentally the best deal the United States can get, it's hard to see again that's worth the trade. So then there's this question about sanctions, right? This is our UN ambassador, Nikki Haley. And the UN is debating sanctions, Congress has passed sanctions, so it's common to hear after North Korea does a test 2 things at the same time. One, you'll hear people say, we need more sanctions, and the second thing you'll hear other people say is, but sanctions don't work. So I wanted to talk about this as an option for a minute. It is true that sanctions have not convinced North Korea to give up its nuclear and missile programs. Nothing at this point has. That's where people who say sanctions don't work are coming from. There's sort of 2 things I think it's important to know about this. One is that the sanctions really weren't applied seriously until the middle of last year. The United States didn't pass domestic legislation that targeted, say, certain North Korean banking arrangements, etc., until the middle of 2016. It was the North Korea Sanctions Proliferation Enhancement Act. I think I got that right. And it went into force in the middle of last year, which isn't a lot of time, and North Korea had already made a lot of progress before then. The UN sanctions that have been passed just don't get enforced. In fact, I think it's about over 100 of the 200 UN countries haven't turned in a single report. They're supposed to submit these reports about how they implement the sanctions. These sanctions have been around for years, and over half the countries involved, including some of the ones who sponsored the sanctions, haven't turned in a single implementation report. Part of it is that it's tough for these things to work if you don't actually try them, right? But now it's a little bit late. And even if those sanctions had been really sort of perfectly applied and highlighted and done earlier, it's not clear that it would have worked because China is about 85% of North Korea's trade and economic activity at this point. And so unless you could convince China to go along, which is really unlikely for a lot of reasons, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A also, it's not clear that those sanctions would have worked. But we also just don't know, frankly, because we didn't really sort of, I think, aggressively put either U.S. or international sanctions in place until it was a little bit too late. So that's, this is, at this point, I think sanctions will be helpful, mostly for containing the program where it's at, preventing North Korea from doing things like exporting its missile and nuclear programs, components, know-how to other countries. It prevents what we call onward proliferation to other countries that we care about. And that containment part's really, really important. But it means that sanctions are probably just one part of an overall strategy. They're not, I agree with people who say they're unlikely to convince Kim Jong-un to drop the program tomorrow. He's too far into it for that. And so the United States, needs to think about sort of sanctions as part of a larger strategy. And one of the other things you're likely to hear a lot about in the coming, I think, months and even years is missile defense. So the United States just finished installing one of our, what is called THAAD, Theater High Altitude Aerial Defense Systems, in South Korea, on South Korean territory. And what that does is takes a missile that's coming in toward our forces in South Korea and toward our allies' territory and intercepts an incoming missile. Doesn't do anything offensive, but it does intercept missiles as they're coming into South Korea. And that's a picture of some of the components of that coming off a flight from the United States in the middle of the night in April earlier this year. It takes a while to set the system up, and we actually just finished it this past weekend. The other thing you're likely to hear about, though, the other part of missile defense is missile defense for U.S. territory, right? Because Seoul was already in artillery range. Seoul has lived with the threat of being destroyed by North Korean artillery for decades. The ICBM really changes the game. It does change the game for South Korea, but the direct change is really more to the United States and to the U.S. homeland. And so you're likely to hear more about what the United States can do to improve its own missile defenses here at home. And again, this is, I think, an important step and something the United States should look at, but it is not a silver bullet. I mean, missile defense is often described as trying to hit a bullet in midair with another bullet. It's extraordinarily expensive to develop that kind of technology. I think the U.S. ground-based mid-course defense system right now has cost about $40 billion. And the estimate, one of the Missile Defense Agency officials estimated at one point that they asked him, what do you think the chances are that this would work right now if you did a non-test, if you needed to use the system outside of a test scenario? He said, about a coin toss. Probably not what you'd hope for a $40 billion defense investment, right? So, again, these are all important things. There's not going to be one single fix to this problem. So you're likely to hear about sanctions, missile defense, diplomacy. These are all pieces of the puzzle. And the reality is it's not an either or. It's everything has to be done in a coordinated way. And that's what you're likely to see the U.S. talk about. So if you ever hear somebody talking about just one option, you have to remember that the chance of any one option working or protecting the United States on its own is really low. So you need multiple layers of defense and attempt to deal with this problem. Longer term, I think there are actually sort of, I would think about the problem a little bit differently. And so what I'm going to offer here is maybe sort of a three-part way that I think you could think about the longer-term strategy. Right? What we've talked about so far is what do we do about this problem now? What do we have to do today, in the next few weeks, in the next year, to protect the United States and our allies, protect our national security and our economic prosperity? Because we also have a lot at stake economically in Korea and in Asia. So I was going to think about a long-term long-term strategy, I think you'll see discussion about 3 different components. The first is deterrence, and I think some of Secretary Mattis's recent comments that you might have seen on the news are aimed mostly at trying to deter North Korea, right? They're trying to deter us from attacking them. We have to do exactly the same thing, right? So, we need to really emphasize, and this can sound scary, right, to a lot of people, that if North Korea uses nuclear weapons first, that would result in the elimination of the North Korean regime. That's what they care about, and they need to understand that that's what's at stake. If you look at how deterrence works and how it works throughout the Cold War with the Soviet Union, to deter North Korea, you have to convince them that their survival is at stake if they act aggressively first. And again, this is especially important because North Korea has this long-term goal of reunifying the Korean Peninsula under North Korean leadership. It means that North Korea is really prone to kind of doing probing and provocations and testing the waters and seeing if it can split the alliance one way or another. And so it's really important. That's risky, right? That's a risky strategy, and they need to understand that that's risky. Ironically, probably the best way to prevent another Korean war is convincing North Korea that it wouldn't survive one that it started. And so you're likely, I think, to see a lot of very sort of strong and hopefully consistent rhetoric about the cost to North Korea of engaging in certain behavior in the coming months. There's also a containment part, right? We want to prevent the problem from getting any bigger. And that's where diplomacy and sanctions and really aggressive intelligence capabilities and investigation of North Korea's smuggling networks and its ability to move its stuff around the world is going to be really important. So there's a headline this morning that the UN is looking at getting the authority, or passing the authority to intercept all North Korean shipments on the high seas, and that's part of why that's now being considered. And then the last part, I think, the third component, again, because these are mostly defensive, right? This is trying to just prevent it from getting worse. So the question I wanted to end with today, before we open it up for discussion, is there anything we can do to make this better? And I actually think that the answer is yes. So I wanted to explain a little bit about what that would look like. And if you go back and you look at the writing that was done in the early days of the Cold War about how to deal with communist dictatorships, one of the metaphors that comes up a lot is gardening. And if you're like me, that's one of the last metaphors I would have expected to find for talking about nuclear and missile strategy and how to deal with dictators and gardening. Really? And the point was that you can't force a plant or a tree. My grandfather was an apple grower, so this makes a lot of sense to me. You can't force a branch immediately to change direction or it snaps. Right? But you can use a splint, you can use boards, you can tie a branch up a certain way and then use sunlight and water and fertilizer and basically create the conditions with steady pressure and the sort of right environment over time. You can create growth in a certain direction. Right? And that's the metaphor that a lot of our early Cold War strategists actually used for dealing with countries that looked a fair amount like North Korea. And so I think what that would actually, if you think about what that would look like today, I think it means a lot of engagement with the North Korean people rather than necessarily the North Korean regime. Often when people talk about, we need to engage North Korea, they need to go talk to the same people in charge who are doing all of this stuff, which hasn't been very productive. So, North Korea loves it when people come on these big state-sponsored tours. They go visit the statue, they put flowers there. It looks good on North Korean TV. Look, we've got these foreigners coming to acknowledge the greatness of the great leader and the dear leader and now the respected leader, I think is what he goes by. And they pay a whole lot of money and they pay it cash to go, right? I went on an academic trip to North Korea in 2012, so I know a little bit about what these tours look like and how they're organized. I'm happy again to talk more about that in the Q&A, but I think that the travel ban on North Korea, as unfortunate as it is a partial ban. There are exceptions for humanitarian and other work, but I think that it was probably appropriate. The risk to Americans who visit has gone up, As we saw when there was an American college student who came home seriously ill and passed away within days of reaching the United States. It provides a lot of benefits to the North Koreans. There's just very little upside at this point to continuing to have American tourists go and be potential hostages on the ground there. So I'm not so much talking about that kind of like government-run engagement project, but really more engagement with the ordinary people who are in North Korea where possible, and also with the people who have connections to them, and that's the community of refugees and defectors that's now actually a global community. There are around 30,000 North Korean refugees or defectors who've resettled in South Korea, and there are communities in the UK, the US, people who've come who are on the way to becoming or have become United States citizens. So this is one mom and her daughter. That's another set of photos. And a lot of what these people do now is that they try to get information and money and things like medicine and food sometimes back into their families in North Korea to help them be less dependent on the government. North Korea is still largely, in theory, a system where you're supposed to depend on the government even to eat. And so sending money, food, medicine, maybe you can start a sort of small black market business. It gives people a little bit of space away from the regime and helps to empower them. To do that, they also, when they send that stuff, sometimes they also send these USB drives that have information. Sometimes it's just basic stuff like an encyclopedia. Or a medical dictionary, and sometimes it's entertainment, South Korean soap operas, so that people can see what life is like in South Korea. They literally take donated USB drives and put them in plastic bags and walk them across this river, which is one of the two rivers that forms the border between North Korea and China. That's really risky behavior. And to be clear, again, I don't think this is going to create a revolution in North Korea overnight. But what it does do is, first of all, it builds up market mechanisms inside North Korea. North Korea now has become kind of a hybrid between a state-run economy and classic communist, centrally planned economy, and this bottom-up black market economy that ordinary citizens really use now to survive. And so it builds up that market mechanism and that market system inside North Korea from the bottom up. And it also just helps educate ordinary citizens. One of the problems people have when they come to the United States or to South Korea is that a nurse in North Korea might not have familiarity with the medical technology that's used in South Korea or the United States. So it's hard to have the same profession. And that makes that transition hard, and it makes the quality of medical care inside North Korea for the ordinary people who live there who aren't members of the privileged elite difficult. So it creates some education for them. And it gives them, like I said, a small sort of sphere of space that the government doesn't control. And I think that's a good thing in and of itself. And long term, I think it also creates a little bit of pressure. We don't know how much, and I don't think there's any way for sure to know. But it creates a little more pressure on the North Korean regime that comes from just the internal contradiction of having chosen to remain in power by repressing your own people. Right? And the reason that I emphasize this, especially at the end, is that I do think it's one of the few places where there are really hopeful stories coming out of North Korea. So if you look at that little girl, she's growing up today in South Korea instead of in North Korea. I think that it's really neat, actually, that there are people who, in the least democratic place in the world, found freedom, found hope, found out about democracy, and then are able to take incredible risks and then be able to go live that. And not only that, but then turn around and try to help bring that message and those abilities to other people. It's very, very common that one person will leave leave North Korea, get to South Korea, and then send back for family members and reunify a family in South Korea over the course of a couple of years. And I think for us, we actually learn a lot about democratic citizenship when we look at it through the eyes of people who grew up without it. So that's the book project that Stella mentioned that I'm working on now. And recently, as part of that, I visited, this is what I'll close with, I visited this house in Chicago that assists North Korean refugees who come to the United States. President Bush signed a law called the North Korean Human Rights Act where you could leave, if you left North Korea, you crossed this river, you escaped through China, you could actually apply to come to the United States and become a United States citizen. And about 250 people have done that since he signed that act a little over 10 years ago. So I was talking to this young man who's, I said, well, like, what are you excited about? What's going on? And he said, well, I'm really excited because, and this was earlier this year, he said, last summer I passed my citizenship test. So I got to become a United States citizen. And I said, wow, that's really cool. And what a crazy time to become a citizen. We had a presidential election. What did you make of that, watching that process? And he talked about what it meant to, in North Korea, you do have to vote, and there's only one name on the ballot. And the secret police, who are not so secret in this case, stand there and watch you vote. Right? So, the idea of a secret ballot where he didn't have to tell anybody, and he actually had a choice, more choices than he knew what to do with, he thought was really cool. And the fact that he could talk about politics and say he really didn't like somebody without worrying about the police coming to his door in the middle of the night and taking not just him, but his parents and grandparents, and throwing them in a labor camp for the next few generations, meant a lot to him. He thought that was really cool. And as we were talking about it, he turned over his phone, and the only sticker anywhere on his cell phone was this "I voted" sticker from the presidential election that he had voted in. And I thought that was so cool. He recognized what it meant to be a citizen in a democracy, in part because he had grown up in a place that was so different. In the midst of a system like North Korea's, he found out that there was an alternative, and now he gets to sort of live out and be that alternative every day. And I thought that was really neat, that in the middle of, all of this really depressing stuff about nuclear weapons and missiles and war, it's important to remember that there are ordinary people whose lives really matter and who are doing a lot, not just to sort of change their own lives, but also to bring hope to a lot of other people. And I think that it's, if we look at what we want to, what we would want for North Korea in the long term, I think it's, supporting people like him who are trying to sort of live and then pass on that message is one of the best places we could look to for a possible solution. I will stop there. Thank you so much. I know there's a lot that we didn't touch on. I'm happy to take a few questions, but again, thanks